Maya Johnson walked home from school with a bright smile on her face. It had been a good day. She had just finished her science project, and her teacher had told her she had done a great job. Maya was only 12 years old, but she already had big dreams. She wanted to be a scientist one day and make the world a better place. The sun was shining, and a cool breeze brushed against her face as she hummed a song her mother always played on the radio. She loved walking home because it gave her time to think about everything she had learned in school. But today, something happened that changed everything. As she turned a corner near the park, she saw a police car parked on the side of the road. She didn't think much of it. Officers were sometimes around the neighborhood, and Maya had never had any trouble with them before. But as she walked past, she heard a loud voice call out, "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Maya turned around, surprised. A tall police officer, a man with short brown hair and a serious face, was walking toward her. She looked around, wondering if he was talking to someone else, but there was no one else nearby. "Yes, sir," she asked politely, just like her parents had taught her. The officer, whose badge read Wilkins, looked her up and down. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "From school," Maya said, pointing at her backpack. Wilkins narrowed his eyes. "What's with your hair?" he asked, shaking his head. Maya touched her curly hair. She had always loved her natural curls. Her mother helped her take care of them, and her father always said they made her look like a queen. She didn't understand why the officer was asking about it. "It's just my hair," she said, confused. Wilkins sighed and crossed his arms. "You kids these days don't know how to present yourselves properly," he muttered. Then, in a louder voice, he said, "There's a city rule about keeping a neat appearance in public." Maya had never heard of such a rule. She had seen plenty of kids with messy hair, some even with wild hairstyles, but no one had ever said anything about them. "I don't think I did anything wrong, sir," she said, trying to stay calm. The officer frowned. "Are you talking back to me?" Maya felt her heart beat faster. She wasn't trying to be rude, but something didn't feel right. "I'm just saying I didn't do anything bad." Wilkins shook his head. "You need to learn some respect," he said. Then, before Maya could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. Maya's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping back. Before she could move away, Wilkins grabbed a chunk of her curls and, with one quick motion, cut them off. Maya gasped. It all happened so fast that she didn't have time to react. She felt the weight of her hair fall from her head. She reached up and touched the uneven strands that were left. Tears filled her eyes. "There, that's better," Wilkins said, putting the knife back in his pocket. "Next time, make sure you look presentable." Maya couldn't believe what had just happened. She wanted to scream, to say something, but she was too shocked. The people around her had stopped to watch, their faces showing disbelief. Some took out their phones, recording everything. Maya felt her legs shaking. Without another word, she grabbed her backpack and ran. She didn't stop running until she reached her front door. Tears streamed down her face as she pounded on the door, hoping someone would open it quickly. When the door swung open, she saw her father standing there. One look at his daughter's tear-streaked face and the uneven mess of her hair, and he knew something terrible had happened. Maya threw herself into his arms, sobbing. Her father gently stroked her back. His voice was calm but firm. "Maya, tell me everything." And when she did, his face darkened. His jaw clenched. The strong, powerful man who had fought for justice for so many others now had only one thought in his mind. He was going to make sure this officer regretted ever laying a hand on his daughter. Maya sat on the couch, holding the uneven strands of her hair in her hands. She kept touching the spot where the officer had cut it, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But it wasn't. The reality of what had happened sank in deeper with every passing second. Her father, David Johnson, knelt in front of her, gently holding her shoulders. His eyes were full of concern. "Maya, I need you to tell me exactly what happened," he said, his voice steady but serious. Through sniffles and deep breaths, Maya told him everything. She explained how she was just walking home, how the officer stopped her, and how, without warning, he cut her hair right there on the street. As she spoke, her father's hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened. Her mother, Angela, stood nearby, covering her mouth in shock. "He did what?" she whispered, barely able to believe it. Maya nodded, fresh tears spilling from her eyes. "He said my hair wasn't neat," she said, her voice trembling. "He said I had to look presentable." David took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for his daughter's sake. But inside, a storm was building. He had fought against injustice for years as a civil rights lawyer, but this time, it wasn't just another case. This was personal. Someone had humiliated his little girl, and he wasn't going to let it go. Just then, Maya's older brother, Jordan, walked into the room. He had just come back from basketball practice and could see something was wrong right away. "What happened?" he asked, looking between his parents and Maya. Angela shook her head, still in disbelief. "A police officer cut Maya's hair." Jordan's eyes widened. "What? Are you serious?" Maya nodded. People were watching. Some were even recording. David looked up at her. People were recording. Maya wiped her eyes. "Yes, I saw some people holding their phones." David stood up immediately and grabbed his own phone. "That means there's proof," he said. "We're going to find those videos." He opened his laptop and searched online. Within minutes, he found it. The video had already started spreading. Someone had uploaded it, and now thousands of people were watching what had happened to his daughter. He clicked on it, and as the video played, anger burned in his chest. There it was, clear as day. Officer Wilkins stopping Maya, talking to her, and then, without hesitation, cutting her hair. The people around gasped as it happened. Some shouted at the officer, while others stood frozen in shock. And then, Maya running away in tears. Angela covered her mouth again, her eyes brimming with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. "How could he do this?" Jordan shook his head, furious. "This is messed up." David didn't say a word at first. He watched the video again, making sure he caught every detail. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call was to a journalist he knew. "You need to see this video," he said. "The world needs to see what happened." The second call was to his legal team. "We're filing a case," he said. "This officer is going to answer for what he did." By the next morning, the video had gone viral. News stations were talking about it, and social media was filled with outrage. People demanded action. Meanwhile, in his office, Officer Wilkins sat staring at his phone. He had seen the video too. At first, he didn't think much of what he had done. But now, as he scrolled through the thousands of comments calling for his removal, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. And then he saw a news article that made his stomach drop. Civil rights attorney David Johnson to take legal action against Officer Wilkins. His hand started shaking. He had no idea that the girl he had humiliated was the daughter of one of the most powerful lawyers in the country. For the first time, fear crept into his heart. David couldn't sit still. The more he thought about what had happened to Maya, the more his anger grew. He had worked hard his entire life to fight for justice, and now it felt personal. His daughter, his baby girl, had been disrespected in the worst way possible. He had always taught his kids to stand tall, to never let anyone make them feel small, but now he was the one who had to show them what it meant to fight back. As the phone calls continued, David's mind was focused on one thing: taking action. The video of Maya being mistreated had spread everywhere. It was already on the news, and people were outraged. The situation was bigger than just his daughter. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged by someone in a position of power. David knew the officer's name now, Brad Wilkins, and he felt a surge of determination. But he also knew that he had to be careful. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about sending a message. Maya was strong, and her courage had already made an impact. But David wanted the world to see what happened when people like Wilkins abused their power. As he worked on his case, David could see the support from his community grow stronger. Activists, civil rights leaders, and even everyday people reached out to offer their support. Messages of encouragement flooded in, and people shared their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. Maya's story had sparked something in others, and now the fight was bigger than just her and her family. It was a fight for justice for everyone. Maya, though still shaken by what had happened, began to feel a sense of pride in her heart. Her father's strength gave her confidence, and she knew that standing up for what was right was more important than anything else. But there was still the matter of the officer, Brad Wilkins. He had been quiet since the incident, and David had no doubt that he was nervous. He had never expected things to go this far, but now he had to face the consequences of his actions. As the days passed, Maya couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it all was. Why did it matter how her hair looked? Why did the officer treat her like that in front of everyone? She had always been proud of her natural curls. Her mom had taught her to love herself exactly as she was, and her father had always told her she was beautiful no matter what. But now, all she could feel was the emptiness where her hair used to be. It was hard to walk around with people staring at her, noticing the uneven patch of hair that had been chopped off. Some kids at school whispered behind her back, but Maya kept her head up. She was strong, just like her father had always told her. She was going to get through this. At night, David would sit with Maya and talk about everything. They talked about the case, about the people who were supporting them, and about how much this had already changed. Maya's voice grew steadier with each conversation. She knew that her father would do everything he could to make sure justice was served. But David also saw that his daughter was carrying something heavy. She was a brave young girl, but the hurt in her eyes was clear. It was the hurt of being treated like she didn't matter, the hurt of being made to feel less than what she was. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, David reached over and took her hand. "You know, Maya," he said softly, "what happened to you wasn't your fault, and it doesn't define you. It's just one person who made a terrible mistake." Maya looked up at her father, feeling the warmth of his words. "I know, Dad, but it still hurts." "I know, sweetie," David said, gently squeezing her hand. "But we're going to make sure this never happens again, to you or anyone else." Maya smiled, the weight on her shoulders feeling a little lighter. Her father's promise gave her the strength to keep going. The next morning, David sent a letter to the police department demanding that Officer Wilkins be held accountable. He was determined to make sure the officer faced the consequences for his actions. He would not allow anyone to hurt his daughter without paying the price. As the day went on, the news picked up the story again, focusing on the growing calls for justice. People rallied behind the Johnson family, supporting their cause and speaking out against the mistreatment Maya had suffered. And in that moment, David knew that this fight wasn't just about winning a case. It was about giving his daughter the confidence to know that she was loved, that she mattered, and that no one could take away her voice. As the days passed, the story of Maya's mistreatment continued to spread. The news was full of interviews, social media posts, and comments about what had happened. People everywhere were talking about it. Some were shocked, others were angry, and many voiced their support for Maya and her family. It was clear that the incident had struck a nerve with a lot of people. Maya's story wasn't just a local one anymore. It had become a symbol of how far things still needed to go when it came to treating everyone equally. The video of Officer Wilkins cutting her hair had made its way across news stations, and now the entire country was watching. David could feel the weight of the situation. As a civil rights lawyer, he had fought many battles for justice, but this one was different. It wasn't just a legal case to him, it was personal. He had to make sure that Officer Wilkins understood the consequences of his actions. David spent every waking moment preparing for the legal fight ahead. His phone was constantly buzzing with calls from reporters, activists, and even people who had experienced similar situations. The support from the community was overwhelming, but David knew this wasn't going to be easy. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. Officer Wilkins had treated Maya like she was less than human, just because of how she looked. He had no right to do that. The law was supposed to protect everyone, no matter their race, no matter their appearance. Maya, though still shaken, found strength in her father's words and actions. She felt proud to see how many people were standing up for her, but she still couldn't forget the feeling of humiliation when the officer cut her hair. It was hard to walk down the street without people staring at her. Some classmates at school asked if she was okay, while others simply whispered behind her back. But Maya did her best to hold her head high. She had her family behind her, and that made her feel stronger. One evening after dinner, David sat down with Maya and Jordan. They gathered around the kitchen table, the familiar smell of freshly baked cookies filling the room. David placed his hand on Maya's shoulder. "I want you to know that you're not alone in this," he said. "People all over are fighting for you, and we're going to make sure this never happens again." Maya smiled, feeling a little better. "I know, Dad, but I just wish it didn't have to be like this." David nodded. "I know, sweetie, but sometimes when things go wrong, we have to stand up and fight. You've already shown so much strength just by telling your story. You're inspiring others." Jordan chimed in, his voice full of support. "That's right, Maya. What happened to you was wrong, but you've got the whole world behind you now." Maya felt a warmth in her chest as she listened to her family's encouragement. She had always looked up to her dad, admired his courage and strength, but now she realized she was stronger than she had thought. The next day, David met with a group of his colleagues. Together, they went over the case, looking at every piece of evidence. They had the video, they had Maya's testimony, and they had the support of the community. It was clear that the officers' actions were unjustifiable. They began preparing to take the case to court, but David also knew that the battle was bigger than just winning a legal victory. He needed to change how people viewed these issues, how they viewed children like Maya, who were unfairly targeted simply because of the way they looked. Word of David's upcoming lawsuit began to spread, and the pressure on the local police department grew. People were demanding answers. How could an officer do something so wrong, especially to a child? The mayor's office was flooded with calls, and the police chief was being asked for a public statement. As the case gained momentum, the Johnson family found themselves at the center of a much larger conversation about race, justice, and fairness. David spoke to the press, explaining how important it was to hold the officer accountable, not just for Maya's sake, but for the sake of every child who might face similar treatment. Maya wasn't sure what to think of all the attention. On one hand, she was proud that people were speaking out and supporting her. But on the other hand, it made her feel exposed. She just wanted to be a regular kid again, to go to school without feeling like everyone was watching her. But despite the uncertainty, she knew she had done the right thing by sharing her story. And as the days passed, the calls for justice only grew louder. Maya's voice, and the support from her family, were becoming a powerful force that no one could ignore. The days seemed to blur together as the case against Officer Wilkins moved forward. The public's support for Maya continued to grow. People from all walks of life were speaking out, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, and standing up for Maya's right to be treated with dignity and respect. It felt like everyone was rallying around her, and though she still felt uneasy about all the attention, she couldn't help but feel proud of the difference her story was making. David spent long hours preparing for the upcoming court battle. He and his legal team worked tirelessly, going over every detail to make sure they were ready. He was determined to win, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by someone in authority. He knew this case was bigger than just one officer's mistake. It was a fight for justice that could set an example for others. Maya tried her best to carry on with her life, though it wasn't easy. School was harder now. Some of the kids who had once been her friends avoided her, unsure of what to say. Others came up to her to offer their support, telling her how brave she was. But it wasn't the same. She didn't want to be the center of attention, and all the stares made her feel more self-conscious than ever. Still, every night, when she was alone with her thoughts, she reminded herself why she was doing this. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You're inspiring others." And though it was hard, she knew that standing up for herself was important. She didn't want anyone else to feel the way she did, small, humiliated, and alone. One evening after dinner, Maya and David sat on the couch, watching TV. The news was covering the case again. Maya's heart raced when she saw the footage of Officer Wilkins. It was a reminder of the painful moment, but now it didn't feel as raw. She was learning to accept it and not let it control her. David reached for the remote and turned off the TV. He smiled at his daughter. "You're handling this better than I ever could have imagined," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Maya smiled back, though she still felt a little uncertain. "I just want this to be over," she admitted quietly. "I know, sweetheart," David replied, his voice gentle. "But just remember, you're not just doing this for you. You're doing it for every kid who's ever felt like they didn't matter. You're giving them a voice." Maya nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. It was hard to put into words, but she was starting to understand just how important this fight really was. It wasn't just about her hair or the officer. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult it was. The next few days brought more pressure. The media was relentless, following every step of the case, and soon a date was set for the trial. David prepared his arguments, making sure they had all the evidence they needed. The video of Officer Wilkins cutting Maya's hair would be a key piece, but they were also bringing in witnesses, people who had seen the officer's behavior and could testify to what had happened. Maya couldn't help but feel nervous about the trial. The thought of standing in front of a judge and speaking in court made her stomach twist. She wasn't sure she was ready to face Officer Wilkins in that setting, but her father reassured her that she wouldn't have to speak if she didn't want to. He would handle everything. The most important thing was that Maya had already made a difference just by sharing her story. As the days passed, the pressure on Officer Wilkins grew. The community was demanding answers, and the local police department had to respond. Wilkins hadn't spoken publicly since the incident, and now his silence was only adding to the tension. People were beginning to question his actions, and many were calling for him to be held accountable. On the morning of the trial, David and Maya arrived at the courthouse early. The building loomed in front of them, and for the first time, Maya felt the weight of what was about to happen. She held her father's hand tightly, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. Inside the courthouse, David went over the details of the case one last time with his team. Maya sat quietly, watching the lawyers and witnesses prepare. She couldn't help but feel nervous, but her father's presence beside her gave her strength. She knew she wasn't alone. She knew they were doing the right thing. And no matter what happened in the courtroom, she had already won in a way. She had inspired change. Soon, the doors to the courtroom opened and the case began. David stood up, his voice steady and firm. As he presented the evidence, Maya sat in the back, watching her father, feeling a sense of pride that she hadn't felt before. This was the start of something important, and Maya was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse was quiet, the air filled with a sense of anticipation. Maya sat with her family, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been to court before, and everything felt so serious. She could hear the shuffle of papers, the murmur of people talking in low voices, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing down the halls. It was all so overwhelming, and Maya couldn't help but feel nervous. But as she sat there, she felt her father's reassuring hand on her shoulder. David had always been a source of strength for her, and today was no different. He had promised her that he would take care of everything. And right now, he was doing exactly that. He was talking with his team, going over their strategy one last time before the case began. Maya looked around the courtroom, noticing how formal everything was. The judge sat high on his bench, wearing a serious expression as he read over his notes. The lawyers were all in their suits, standing in front of their tables, ready for the battle ahead. Maya had never seen her father in this environment before. He looked different, calm, collected, but also determined. She could see the fire in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for her. Finally, the trial began. The room fell silent, and everyone stood as the judge entered. Maya's heart raced as she sat back down, her eyes focused on her father. David stood up and approached the judge's bench. He spoke clearly, his voice calm but firm. He introduced himself as Maya's father and explained that he was representing her in this case. Maya listened closely, understanding that today was important not just for her but for everyone who had ever been mistreated. The first thing David did was present the video. The entire courtroom watched as the footage of Officer Wilkins cutting Maya's hair played on the big screen. Maya's heart sank as she saw herself again, standing there, shocked and confused, as her hair was being cut without her consent. She wanted to look away, but she forced herself to keep her eyes on the screen. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. David then spoke about what had happened that day. He explained how Maya had been walking home from school, just like any other day, when Officer Wilkins had stopped her. He described how the officer had cut her hair without any reason, without asking for permission, and without any valid cause. Maya wasn't just a victim of a careless mistake. She had been treated unfairly because of how she looked. As David spoke, Maya couldn't help but notice the faces of the people in the courtroom. The judge looked serious, nodding as David presented the evidence. The jury members listened intently, their expressions focused. Maya's heart swelled with gratitude. Her father was doing everything he could to make sure justice was served. Next, David called witnesses to testify. Several people who had been there when the incident happened spoke up. They told the court what they had seen, how the officer had acted with little regard for Maya's feelings, how people had tried to intervene, and how shocked they had been by the officer's behavior. Some people had even recorded the event on their phones, and their testimonies added weight to the case. As the witnesses spoke, Maya felt a strange mix of emotions. She was grateful that people had seen what had happened and were willing to stand up for her. But at the same time, hearing others talk about the event made her feel exposed. She just wanted it all to end. But her father kept reminding her that this was necessary. "This is how change happens, Maya," he had told her earlier. "Sometimes it takes something big to get people to pay attention. We're doing this not just for you, but for everyone who's been hurt." The day continued with arguments from both sides. The defense team, representing Officer Wilkins, tried to explain that the officer had acted out of concern for Maya's appearance, but David quickly countered that argument. He explained that the officer had no right to treat Maya that way, no matter the reason. The courtroom was tense, and Maya could feel the weight of the moment. It was clear that the case was being taken seriously. The judge asked questions, and the lawyers responded with thoughtful answers. Everyone in the room was paying attention. This was more than just a legal case. It was a fight for fairness, for equality, and for respect. At the end of the day, the judge called for a short recess. Maya's family gathered in a corner of the courtroom, all of them trying to process what had just happened. Maya looked at her father, her emotions running high. "Dad, do you think we're going to win?" she asked quietly. The next day, the courtroom was filled with tension. Maya could feel the weight of the trial pressing down on her. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a battle for justice, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in authority. David could sense the pressure too. As he prepared to make his closing argument, he looked over at Maya, who was sitting quietly beside him. She was trying her best to stay calm, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He smiled reassuringly and whispered, "You've done great. You've already made a difference." Maya nodded, though she still felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Her father's confidence made her feel stronger, but she couldn't deny the anxiety building up inside her. What would happen after all this? Would the officer be held accountable for his actions? Would the world start to change? Maya wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for sure. She had done everything she could. The judge called the court to order, and everyone stood as he entered. Maya sat up straight, her hands resting in her lap. She knew the end was near, the moment when the verdict would be read. It was a moment that could change everything. David stood up to give his closing statement. He was calm, collected, and his voice carried a weight of truth that filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "what we are dealing with here is not just an incident involving a child's hair. It's a matter of respect, dignity, and basic human rights." He paused, making sure everyone was listening. Maya is not just a victim here. She is a child who was humiliated in front of her peers. She was treated as if she didn't matter, as if her worth was determined by the way she looked. And this happened simply because of the color of her skin. David's words rang through the courtroom. The room was still, everyone hanging on to each word he spoke. What we are asking for is not just an apology. We are asking for justice. We are asking for this officer to be held accountable for his actions, and for everyone to understand that this is not just about Maya. It's about standing up for what is right. Maya could feel her heart pounding as her father spoke. She didn't realize how powerful his words could be until now. It wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that no one else ever had to go through what she had. The defense lawyer stood next, trying to defend Officer Wilkins. He claimed that the officer had acted with good intentions, that he had merely been trying to help Maya by cutting her hair. But David was quick to refute that argument. He reminded the jury that good intentions didn't justify disrespecting a child's body or treating her with such carelessness. Maya tried not to look at the defense attorney. Every word felt like an attack on her, but she knew that she had her father by her side. She trusted him completely. He was doing everything he could to make sure that justice would be served. As the day wore on, the jury deliberated. Maya and her family waited, trying to stay calm, but it was hard. David knew that the case had been strong, but even he couldn't predict how the jury would decide. Would they believe in the justice they were fighting for? Would they see the importance of holding people accountable, no matter their position or title? Hours passed, and Maya could feel the tension building. She was nervous, but she tried her best to stay focused. She thought about her friends, her school, and the community that had supported her. She thought about all the people who had shared their own stories of injustice, who had stood by her side. Finally, the jury returned. The room grew silent as the judge asked them to deliver their verdict. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Maya's stomach twisted as she waited for the decision. Her father sat beside her, his face calm but his eyes filled with anticipation. He took her hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. The judge looked at the jury foreman and nodded. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper with the decision. "We have, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. Maya's heart was racing. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The judge turned to the jury and asked, "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat and read aloud. "We, the jury, find Officer Wilkins guilty of misconduct. We believe that his actions toward Maya Johnson were inappropriate, unjust, and violated her rights." A wave of relief washed over Maya. She didn't expect to feel this emotional, but the moment the words were spoken, she felt as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The decision wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged. David looked at Maya with a proud smile. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes said it all. Maya had won. The courtroom was filled with a quiet hum as the judge wrapped up the verdict. Officer Wilkins, now sitting with his defense team, looked stunned. The room seemed to hold its breath as the decision sank in. Maya could hardly believe what had just happened. She glanced at her father, who was sitting beside her, his eyes shining with pride. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. The judge spoke, confirming the decision once more. Officer Wilkins was found guilty of misconduct. There was no more questioning, no more uncertainty. The justice Maya had been seeking had finally been achieved. As the room began to empty, Maya sat quietly, taking in everything around her. The sounds of people shuffling, talking in hushed voices, and the clink of the chairs as they moved didn't seem to register in her mind. Her thoughts were racing. She had won. But it wasn't just her. It was for all the people who had ever been treated unfairly. It was for those who had been made to feel invisible, as if their voices didn't matter. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You're making a difference, Maya." And she realized that she truly was. As they walked out of the courthouse, Maya's heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. The heavy feeling she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. The struggle wasn't over. The fight for equality, fairness, and respect was still ongoing. But this was a victory, a step forward. And Maya had played a part in it. She had done something brave, something powerful, and it had made a difference. The crowd outside the courthouse was full of people who had heard the news. There were reporters with cameras, a few smiling faces offering support, and even people holding up signs that said, "Justice for Maya," and "We stand with you." It was overwhelming, but also heartwarming. Maya couldn't help but feel grateful for all the people who had stood by her. Her father turned to her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, Maya," he said. "You stood up, and you made sure your voice was heard." Maya smiled, feeling a sense of warmth fill her chest. "We did it, Dad." They walked together to the car, the sun shining brightly above them. As they got in, Maya leaned back in her seat, letting out a sigh of relief. The world outside seemed just a little bit brighter. David glanced over at her. "You know, I don't think you realize how big this is, Maya. Your courage has inspired so many people. Your story is giving others the strength to speak up too." Maya nodded, but there was still so much on her mind. She thought about the officer, about what would happen to him now. She thought about the future, about how much more needed to be done. But for now, she also allowed herself a moment to feel proud. This was her victory, and she had earned it. As they drove home, Maya couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The trial had been difficult, and there had been moments when she felt unsure of herself. But the support of her father and the countless others who believed in her made all the difference. She hadn't been alone, and that thought gave her a sense of strength that she had never felt before. That night, as Maya sat at the dinner table, she realized something important. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about using your voice to make the world a better place. And Maya knew that, even though this chapter had come to a close, there was still so much work to be done. But she was ready. She felt stronger than she ever had before, and she was determined to keep fighting for the justice that everyone deserved. David smiled at her from across the table. "I'm proud of you, Maya. No matter what happens next, you've already changed the world for the better." Maya smiled back. "Thanks, Dad. And we're not done yet."